Red dust clung thick to everything like a hot coat. Emma Richardson stood under the shade of a withered acacia tree, binoculars pointed toward the elephant herd moving slowly across the cracked plain. 12 animals. She counted again for the third time that day, as if the number might change if she counted enough times. 3 years in Kenya, but Emma had never seen conditions this bad. She had witnessed dry seasons, had seen waterholes shrink to mud puddles, but this season was different. This season even the mud was gone. Only cracked earth remained like a broken mosaic fragments of a world that had once teemed with life. And Jerry the matriarch stopped walking, her trunk lifted testing the air. Emma knew that gesture. 3 years studying this herd, she had learned to read their body language like an open book. Jerry was weighing options, calculating, facing a decision no creature wanted to make, stay or go. Tembo, the 3-year-old calf, pressed close to her mother's legs. Even from this distance, Emma could see the ribs protruding under the gray skin. The calf needed water. They all needed water. But where was the water? Emma lowered her binoculars, wiping sweat from her forehead. The temperature had reached 45 degrees, and it was only 9 in the morning. The Land Cruiser parked behind her engine off to conserve fuel. David Kimani, the local ranger, sat in the vehicle's shade, checking GPS equipment. 3 years ago, when Emma first came to Kenya, she carried the passion of a young conservationist from Colorado. She believed in data and research in systems. She believed that if they collected enough data, wrote enough reports, then someone somewhere would listen. 3 years later, she knew that data couldn't save a dying elephant from thirst. Emma walked toward the vehicle. David looked up, his face heavy. He didn't need to say anything. She already knew what he had found on the map. The nearest water hole had dried up last week. The next one was 80 kilometers away, and even that was just rumor from livestock herders. They sat in silence, watching the herd. Jerry began moving again, leading north toward what she remembered. In her brain, carved deep through generations, was a map. The water paths her grandmother had walked, that her mother had walked. The survival routes. But those paths were drawn for a different world, a world where rain came on time, where rivers never completely dried up, where you could trust the cycle of seasons. That world no longer existed. Emma opened her laptop, looking at the satellite map. Lake Turkana, 300 kilometers north. That was the only place with water left where all the elephant herds were heading, following instinct, following ancestral memory. 300 kilometers through East Africa's harshest terrain. She remembered last year's report. Another herd had tried. 15 animals started. 9 reached the destination. 6 fell along the way, a combination of exhaustion, dehydration, and poachers who knew that weak animals were easy prey. David looked at her, the unspoken question hanging between them. Was there another way Emma had worked long enough to know the rules? Let nature decide. Don't interfere with natural cycles. Let wild animals be wild. But there was nothing natural about this. Nothing natural about drought amplified by climate change, about a world where rain no longer came, where rivers dried up because of hydroelectric dams, where grazing areas had encroached on 1,000-year-old migration routes. If humans created the problem, did humans have a responsibility to solve it? That night in her tent, Emma couldn't sleep. She lay staring into darkness, listening to the distant roar of lions. The predators were hungry too. Everything in the ecosystem was collapsing at once. She thought about Tembo, about how the calf looked at her mother with absolute trust, about how Jerry stood shielding her child from the sun, trying to create shade for the small body. An idea began to form. Crazy. Never tried. Could fail. But might also work. The next morning, Emma called the office in Nairobi. Her voice shook as she presented the plan. Use water trucks. Create an artificial water route. Guide the herd section by section, creating rest stops between here and Lake Turkana. Silence on the other end of the line. Then questions. Cost, manpower, precedent risk. Emma had answers for everything except the most important question. Would this work? The answer they gave was no. Too expensive. Too risky. Not enough data. More research needed. Emma hung up. She looked outside where the herd had begun moving. They didn't have time for more research. No time for reports, approvals, and bureaucratic loops. They had maybe a week left, perhaps 2. She looked at David. He was standing by the old ranger station truck checking the tires. He looked up, caught her eye. In that moment, no words were needed. They had worked together long enough. Sometimes rules needed to be broken. Sometimes the right action wasn't the approved action. Sometimes you just had to start driving. The first waterhole was created at 3 in the morning. Emma and David parked the truck on relatively flat ground about 200 meters from the elephant's projected path. They pulled out the hoses, opened the valves, watched water pour onto the cracked earth. The ground drank the water like a dry sponge. For the first few minutes, all the water seemed to disappear into the earth. But gradually a small pool began to form flashlight beams reflecting on the surface. Emma crouched by the pool, touching the damp ground. She felt foolish. This might never work, and Jerry might never find it. Or find it, but not trust it. Or trust it, but too late. David placed a hand on her shoulder. He said nothing. No need to say anything. They had made their decision. Now they could only wait. They drove to a position 1 kilometer away, turned off the engine, sat in darkness, watching GPS. The herd was 10 kilometers away, moving slowly through the night. Jerry traveled at night because it was cooler, because the chances of survival were better. Dawn came painting distant clouds red and orange. Emma couldn't sleep. She sat with binoculars scanning the horizon, waiting. 8 o'clock. Nothing. 9 o'clock. Temperature soaring. Emma drank from her water bottle, acutely aware of the irony. She had water. The elephants did not. 10 o'clock. David began talking about moving, creating the next pool. Maybe they had miscalculated the route. And then Emma saw them. At first, just a gray streak on the brown horizon. But gradually, shapes became clear. Elephants, 12 animals moving in single file, and Jerry leading. Emma gripped her binoculars, heart pounding. They were coming. They were heading the right way, but would they find the water? The herd came closer. 500 meters, 300. And Jerry stopped. Trunk raised, testing, searching. Emma realized she was holding her breath. Jerry turned right, walked straight toward the pool. She had smelled it. From 300 meters through the hot, dry air, and Jerry had caught the scent of water. The herd accelerated. Tembo ran alongside her mother. They reached the pool, and for a moment Emma worried they would hesitate, suspicious of this strange water source. But Tembo didn't hesitate. The calf plunged straight into the water trunk, sucking and spraying. The others followed. For several minutes, they drank bathed, sprayed water on each other's backs. Emma discovered she was crying. David was too. They sat in the vehicle looking through the windshield, watching 12 elephants enjoy the simple gift water. But one pool wasn't enough. They needed dozens. Needed to cross hundreds more kilometers. And so they began, each day going ahead of the herd, creating pools, waiting, watching Jerry lead her family forward. Then continuing, creating the next pool. It was tedious but vital work, driving on roads that didn't exist, pulling hoses in the burning heat, waiting, hoping, praying. But it worked. Each day the herd walked another 15-20 kilometers. Each day they got closer to Lake Turkana. Each day they stayed alive. On the 5th day, one of the trucks broke down. The engine overheated in 48-degree heat. David spent 3 hours under the hood trying to repair with limited tools. Emma sat in non-existent shade watching GPS. The herd was approaching. They needed to move. Finally, David got the engine running again, but they had lost precious time. When they created the next pool, it was late afternoon. And when the herd arrived, Emma noticed something different. They were more tired, moving slower. A young bull at the back of the line was limping. The journey was destroying them. That night, Emma recalculated. They had covered 120 kilometers. 180 remained. At the current pace, at least 9 more days. 9 days through increasingly harsh terrain. Her money was running out. They were buying fuel on credit that David negotiated with promises and friendship. The old truck was falling apart under the pressure. And most importantly, the water on the truck was running out faster than expected. Higher temperatures, drier ground. Water evaporated and soaked in faster than they had calculated. Emma sat by the truck looking at the star-filled sky. She began to doubt for the first time. Maybe they were wrong. Maybe they were just prolonging suffering instead of preventing it. David sat down beside her. It was a long time before he spoke. He had lost a herd last year. 10 animals. They died in the drought. He had found them a chain of white bones in the desert. He told her that scene haunted him every night. He didn't want to find Jerry like that. Didn't want to find Tembo like that. They sat in silence. Above the Milky Way stretched across the sky a river of light in the endless darkness. The next morning, they continued. On the 8th day, everything changed. Emma was checking her phone at a rare signal point when she saw it. The video they had posted 3 days ago, a short clip of Timbo drinking water, had been shared thousands of times. She scrolled through comments. People from around the world were following, cheering, asking how they could help. David read over her shoulder. For a moment, both were silent. Then she typed a message, brief, honest. They were on day 8. 180 kilometers remained. They needed help. She didn't know what would happen when she hit send. Didn't dare hope. But sometimes hope isn't something you seek. It's something that finds you. Day 9 began like every other day. Emma and David woke before dawn, checked GPS, drove to the next point, poured water, waited. But when Emma checked her phone, the screen was flooded with notifications. Their video had gone viral. Not thousands, millions of views. People were sharing, commenting, tagging friends, influencers, artists, people Emma had never heard of, but who had millions of followers, and they had created fundraising pages, Discord servers, hashtags. A complete movement had formed overnight, strangers working together, organizing, planning. Emma scrolled through messages. Someone had contacted Kenya Wildlife Service. Someone else had called water transport companies in Nairobi. A group had created detailed maps tracking the herd's location in real time. The problem was no longer that no one cared. The problem was that too many people cared at once and no one knew what to do first. But a little longer turned out to be the biggest challenge. At midday, while Emma and David were creating the 14th pool, David suddenly stopped. He was staring at the GPS. The herd had stopped. Emma looked over his shoulder. The dots on the screen representing 12 elephants had been motionless for 2 hours. They hurried to the vehicle, drove toward the signal. Emma's heart pounded. The herd never stopped during the day. They always moved, always pressed forward, unless something was wrong. They found the herd in a shallow valley. 11 elephants stood in a circle. In the middle, lying on the ground, was the old female Emma had followed for 3 years, the grandmother of the herd who had taught Njeri the migration routes. She couldn't stand up. Emma and David parked 500 meters away. They couldn't get closer. This was a private moment, the herd's own tragedy. They watched through binoculars. Njeri stood over the old female trunk, gently touching her head. Timbo and the others stood quietly, understanding what was happening in a way only elephants could understand. Emma felt despair spread through her. They had tried so hard, had come so far, and now when help was coming, when they were closer to their destination than ever, it could all end here, because Njeri wouldn't leave the old female behind. Emma knew this. Elephant herds don't abandon anyone. They would stay here in the burning sun until... She couldn't complete that thought. David looked at her. They needed to do something. But what Emma looked around, their truck had water, had shade, but they couldn't get close. Wild elephants didn't trust humans that much. Except, she remembered the past 8 days, how Njeri had learned to recognize the sound of their truck's engine, how the herd had stopped running when the vehicle approached, how Timbo had looked directly at Emma when drinking water. Maybe they had built something, a fragile, unlikely trust, but real. Emma made her decision. She drove the truck slowly toward the herd, not directly, but in a curve non-threatening. Stopped 100 meters away, turned off the engine, waited. The elephants were alert. Several moved outward, positioning themselves between the truck and the old female, protecting. But Njeri didn't move. She looked at the truck, looked at Emma through the windshield. Emma opened the door slowly, stepped out. She didn't look directly at Njeri, that was a challenge. Instead, she moved to the back of the truck, opened the water valve, let water flow onto the ground, the sound of water hitting dry earth. She waited 5 minutes, 10 minutes, didn't dare look, didn't dare hope. Then she heard it. Heavy footsteps. The herd was moving, not running away, coming closer. Njeri led. She approached the truck trunk, raised, assessing. After an endless moment, she stepped toward the water. The others followed. They drank. And in the truck's shade in the flowing water, the old female also drank. Not much. Not enough to save her, but enough to give her strength for another hour, another day, enough to continue. David called the veterinary rescue team volunteers who had joined after the video went viral. They came with medicine equipment. They couldn't save the old female. Age and drought had caused too much damage, but they could make her more comfortable, could give her a little more time, and time was all they needed. At sunset, the rescue convoy from Nairobi arrived, 3 large trucks newer and more powerful than anything Emma had ever hoped for. The driver stepped out Wilson stern-faced but kind-eyed. He told them he had lost his brother in last year's drought, a herder who had gone too far looking for water for his livestock, never returned. Wilson had found his brother 3 weeks later. He said their video reminded him of his brother, reminded him why water mattered, why life mattered. He wasn't here for money. He was here because he couldn't not be here. With 3 new trucks, they could create larger, more frequent pools. They could go farther ahead of the herd plan better. The team was now 6 people, Emma, David Wilson, and 2 drivers plus a volunteer veterinarian named Grace. They organized like a small army. 1 truck scouting ahead, mapping routes. 1 truck creating the current pool. 1 truck preparing the next. They worked in shifts, taking turns sleeping and driving, maintaining continuous movement, and the herd continued. The old female lasted 2 more days, driven by a will to live that no one could explain. Then on a quiet morning, with the herd around her, she passed away. They buried her with tradition, with respect and silence. The herd stood nearby for an hour, touching trunks to where she lay. Then Jerry turned away, began walking. North. Always north. They were now 11. But 11 still alive. 11 still fighting. David began live streaming the journey. At first just because he thought people wanted to watch, but it became something more. Each day, millions followed. Not just watching, but participating. They counted every kilometer, cheered when the herd was tired, celebrated each pool. Comments poured in from around the world in many languages, but all saying the same thing. Keep going. You're close. We believe in you. A little girl from Tokyo sent a drawing of Tembo. A man from Brazil created music inspired by the journey. Teachers used the story in classrooms. Families watched together at dinner. Suddenly, 11 elephants in Kenya weren't just wild animals. They were symbols. Hope. Proof that when things were at their worst, humans could still stand up. On the 12th day, they reached the final desert, 40 kilometers with no trees, no shade, nothing but sand and heat. The hardest part of the journey. Emma looked at the map, calculating. With current water supplies and 3 trucks, they could create pools 10 kilometers apart. That meant the herd had to walk 10 kilometers between each drink, in temperatures that could reach 50 degrees. It was feasible, but just barely. They started at dawn when temperature was still bearable, created the first pool, waited for the herd to drink, then raced ahead to create the next. Tembo struggled in the heat. The calf didn't understand why they had to cross this terrible place. But Njeri didn't stop. She had come too far to stop now. By noon the heat began taking its toll. Elephants moved slower. A young bull staggered, lost balance. Wilson drove over, created shade with the truck, poured water so the animal could drink. Emma live-streamed everything. She had no choice. Her phone was nearly dead, but she felt the people watching deserved to see, deserved to know how hard this was. On the phone screen, comments flew by too fast to read, but she understood the spirit. Keep going. Almost there. We're here with you. 4 hours into the desert. Tembo collapsed. The calf was walking and suddenly her legs gave out. She fell into the sand. Didn't move. Emma heard herself cry out, a raw sound she didn't recognize. David stopped the truck immediately. Grace, the veterinarian, ran with her kit, and Jerry stood over the calf trunk, gently touching Tembo's head. The other elephants gathered around. They knew. They understood. Grace examined Tembo. Severe dehydration, heat exhaustion, weak pulse. She got an IV bag, began administering fluids. She poured water over Tembo's body, trying to cool her. Emma knelt in the sand, no longer afraid of the herd, only afraid of losing the calf. David continued live streaming. Emma wanted to tell him to stop. No one should see this. But then she realized they needed to see. The world needed to see what this meant. 10 minutes passed. Tembo didn't move. 20 minutes. Grace continued, working, lips moving in silent prayer. 30 minutes. Emma felt despair crushing her chest. They had come too far. They had asked too much. And then Tembo stirred. Just a little. A small movement of the ear, but it was movement. Grace continued the IV, continued pouring water, and Jerry stood like a statue, refusing to move, refusing to give up. 10 more minutes. Tembo opened her eyes. Emma didn't realize she was crying until David put a hand on her shoulder. On the phone screen, comments went wild. People were crying around the world, celebrating, praying. Tembo slowly sat up, then with Jerry's help stood. The calf was weak, but alive. Emma looked at the map. 25 kilometers remained. Too far for Tembo to walk in this condition, but they couldn't stop. If they stopped in the desert, they would die here. All of them. Wilson solved the problem. He drove the truck slowly beside the herd, creating mobile shade. They poured water into small pools more frequently every 5 kilometers instead of 10. They moved at Tembo's pace, slow but steady, and the herd continued. The sun set. Darkness came, and with it cold. In the desert, temperature dropped sharply at night. They continued in darkness, headlights illuminating the path. On GPS, they watched the distance decrease. 20 kilometers. 15. 10. 5 kilometers. They were so close Emma could feel it. And then as dawn broke, the horizon, Emma saw it. Water. Lake Turkana lay ahead, morning light sparkling on the surface. Vast, beautiful, unbelievable. Jerry stopped at the top of a final rise. She looked, and then she began to run. Not the slow, tired walk of the past 13 days, but running. Pure, wild animal joy. The herd followed. Even Tembo, who seemed to find strength from somewhere deep inside. They ran down the hill across the sand to the water. Emma stopped the truck. She and David sat looking through the windshield. On the phone screen, millions were watching. Servers overloaded and crashed. The live stream froze. But it didn't matter. What mattered was happening at the lake shore. 11 elephants, led by Jerry, plunged into the water. They drank. They bathed. They sprayed water on each other into the air, celebrating in a way only elephants could celebrate. They were alive. They had made it. Emma stepped out of the truck on shaking legs. She walked to the water's edge, knelt down, and she cried, all the emotions of 13 days finally pouring out. David knelt beside her. Wilson and the other drivers joined. Grace. They sat in silence, watching the herd, unable to speak, unable to do anything except witness the miracle they had been part of. Tembo saw Emma. The calf stepped out of the water, walked toward her. Emma stood still, unable to believe what was happening. Tembo came close, and the small wet trunk gently touched Emma's hand. One touch. Simple. Profound. Thank you. The next day, when the live stream was back, people watched the elephants resting by the lake shore. Watched them drink from a source that finally wouldn't run dry. Watched Tembo playing in the shallow water healthy again. Organizations began reaching out. The Kenyan government wanted to formalize what Emma and David had done. They called it the Water Route Protocol, a system for guiding migrating elephant herds during extreme drought periods. Funding came to dig wells, build reservoirs, create lasting infrastructure. Water companies volunteered trucks and drivers. Local people were trained to help. What began as a desperate act by 2 people became a structured program to protect wildlife in an era of changing climate. 3 weeks later, while Emma was at the lake shore checking data, she heard a familiar sound, elephant footsteps. She turned around, and her heart seemed to stop. And Jerry was standing there, not alone. Beside her, tiny and perfect, was a newborn calf. The herd had stayed around Lake Turkana, waiting for the rains to return. And during that time, life had continued. A new generation was born. Emma looked at the small calf, knowing that without that journey, this one would never have existed. Jerry would have died in the desert. This bloodline, this knowledge, this herd, all would have been lost. But they were here, alive, continuing. The following month, when the rainy season finally came, Emma stood watching a scene she wasn't sure she would ever see. The herd began the journey back, returning to the old lands now green again with rainwater. They passed the rescue station, and Jerry stopped, looked toward Emma. No words could describe that look. Recognition, memory, perhaps gratitude, if elephants could feel such things. Then, Jerry turned away, leading her family home. Tembo walked beside her mother, healthy and strong. The small calf walked in the middle, protected by the herd. Emma stood watching until they disappeared on the horizon. David stood beside her silent. Finally, he spoke. "We did it. We saved them." But Emma shook her head. "No," she said. "Not us. Everyone. The driver who lost his brother. The people from around the world who watched and cared. The little girl from Tokyo with her drawing. The scientists and volunteers, and all the people who believed that life matters. We didn't save the herd, we just showed the way. And sometimes that's all that's needed. Sometimes a little hope and a lot of water is enough to create a miracle." Emma returned to her small office. On the wall she had hung a photograph, Timbo standing by the lake-edge trunk, intertwined with her mother's. Every day while working she looked at that photo, and she remembered why she was here, why this work mattered. Not for data or reports, not for fame or recognition, but because somewhere walking through Kenya's grasslands were 12 elephants, now 13 still alive, and that was the only thing that mattered.